Today we'll be looking at how World War One begins. This is Unit 3, Notes number 5. So some of the causes of World War One. Hopefully these will seem like review for you because you should have covered all of this in world history last year. So first cause, imperialism. Generally, four long-term causes can be cited for the start of World War One: imperialism, nationalism, militarism, and the formation of an alliance system. European nations had been building empires, slowly extending their economic and political control over various peoples of the world. Colonies supplied the European powers with raw materials and markets. Germany competed with France and Britain in contest for colonies. So, one thing I want you to kind of pay attention to as we go through these causes is how one cause kind of leads to the other. So, here we have stronger countries looking to extend their influence. So, one, it creates competition between these nations, but then it also creates this dynamic of a stronger nation in overseeing a weaker nation, and kind of the tension that develops because of these imperialistic motivations. Next is nationalism. Nationalism often led to competitive and antagonistic rivalries among nations. Nationalism is the devotion to the interest and culture of one's nation. So the idea that like your culture, your heritage is the best. So if you're German, then you're all about your Germanic heritage. You think everything that Germany does is the best. Everything that you want to do is to make your country greater. So we start to see this rise in nationalism. Just maybe another term could be, patriotic, but like patriotic um, extreme patriotism. Also, various ethnic groups resented being dominated by others and longed for their nations to become independent. So, again, a direct relation to imperialism. So, some countries didn't like the fact that another nation is overseeing them. They're proud of their heritage and they want to be independent. They don't want someone else ruling over them. Many ethnic groups looked to larger nations for protection. So, sometimes they had good relationships. So Serbia was under the rule of the Austrian Hungarian Empire, but they also looked to Russia for protection because they had similar background in terms of their heritage and their culture. So they felt kind of a kinship to Russia. So causes of World War One continued. Militarism. The growth of nationalism and imperialism led to the increased military spending. Each nation wanted stronger armed forces than those of any potential enemy. They practiced militarism, the development of armed forces, their use as a tool of diplomacy. Excuse me. By 1890, the strongest nation on the European continent was Germany. In 1897, Wilhelm II, the German Kaiser, decided to make Germany a major sea power as well. The alliance system. By 1907, there were two major defense alliances in Europe. The Triple Entente, later known as the Allies, consisted of France, Britain, and Russia. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Germany and Austria-Hungary, together with the Ottoman Empire, were later known as the Central Powers. The alliances provided a measure of international security because nations were reluctant to disturb the balance of power. So, with the alliance system, you can kind of think of it as a buddy system where nations are pairing up, saying, if you attack my friend, then I'm going to go and I will attack you too. So, it makes it so that nations are less likely to attack each other because they're fearing retribution, having to be attacked by not just France, but France and Britain and Russia. So, initially, it keeps countries from attacking, but once something does happen, this is how so many other countries get drawn into the conflict. Assassination leads to war. In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, visited the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo. The Black Hand, an organization promoting Serbian nationalism, was responsible for shooting the Archduke and his wife. So here we see some of these different examples. We have the Archduke, the Austrian and Hungarian heir, going into Serbia, a country that they have taken over, that they are overseeing. And then you have the Black Hand, an organization that is promoting Serbian nationalism, basically Serbian independence. They don't want to be overseen, controlled by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So by assassinating the heir, they're making a huge statement. So the assassination set off a diplomatic crisis. The alliance system pulled one nation after another into the conflict. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia to support Austria-Hungary, then on France. Britain then declared war on Germany, and the Great War, what World War I was initially called, had begun. So while this should have been a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Bosnia, it ended up drawing in all of these other countries because of the alliance system. So what was the biggest factor? Imperialism, nationalism, militarism, or the alliance system that led to the start of the Great War, World War I? So we can see elements of imperialism because Austria-Hungary was overseeing Serbia. We can see nationalism because the Black Hand was a Serbian nationalist group and wanted independence. Militarism, we see in terms of competition that nations had with one another. And then lastly, the alliance system because it starts to draw in more countries. So the fighting starts. On August 3rd, 1914, Germany invaded Belgium. The German troops quickly swept through Belgium towards Paris. The Allies were able to halt the German advance in France at the Marne River in September of 1914. So here we see Germany, the way the map looks at the beginning of the war. So we have the way Europe looks at the beginning of the war. So you have Germany here, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So it's a very large country because it has other areas that it's been overseen. What we will see at the end of the war that this gets torn apart and new countries are created like Bosnia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary, so separate nations, Romania is there. Americans questioned neutrality. In 1914, most Americans saw no reason to join a conflict 3,000 miles away. The war did not threaten American lives or property, so America maintained their neutrality. So by being neutral, to be truly neutral, you're not picking a side, you don't care who wins, you do not support either side, you stay out of the conflict altogether. So America was being neutral in the sense that they did not declare war, they did not send troops to fight initially. Germany's aggressive sweep through Belgium increased American sympathy for the Allies. The Germans attacked civilians, destroyed villages, cathedrals, libraries, and even hospitals. So as people are hearing about these atrocities, more Americans are starting to become more sympathetic for the Allies. American economic ties with the Allies were far stronger than its ties to the Central Powers. We had a greater connection and relationship with Great Britain than we did with Germany, so that already kind of leans us to favor the Allies. During the first 2 years of the war, the U.S. exported war supplies like dynamite, cannon powder, submarines, copper wire and tubing, and armored cars. So if we see here in this chart, these are U.S. exports to Europe. So basically supplies that we make in America that we then sell and send to Europe. So for the most part, we see that Great Britain is one of our leading trade partners. But then once the war begins in 1914, we start sending them, double, triple, quadruple the amount of supplies. Whereas with Germany, we begin to slowly stop selling to them until it's basically nothing. And then we begin to increase to France and to other European countries. So yes, we're not sending troops, So we are neutral there, but we are clearly supporting one side over the other with our sale of our goods. The war hits home. Although most Americans favored victory for the Allies rather than the Central Powers, they did not want to join the Allies' fight. By 1917, however, America had mobilized for war against the Central Powers for two reasons. One, to ensure Allied repayment of debts to the U.S., and two, to prevent Germans from threatening U.S. shipping. So Britain had imposed a blockade of German ports to prevent them from accessing goods like food. As a result of this blockade, 750,000 Germans starved to death. So Germany would soon respond to this blockade with a counter blockade by U-boats, German submarines. Any British or Allied ship found in the waters around Britain would be sunk. On May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat sank the British cruise liner the Lusitania. Um, so the Lusitania was a civilian ship. It's just like today, the equivalent of a Carnival cruise ship. It wasn't a military vessel. It wasn't a aircraft carrier. These were just regular people on this ship, just traveling from England to America. 1,198 people were killed with the sinking, and 128 of them were Americans. So Germany defended their action on the grounds that the liner was carrying ammunition. So while it was a cruise liner, it was carrying military supplies. Americans were outraged because of the loss of American life. American public opinion, began to turn against Germany and the Central Powers. German provocation. Despite this provocation, President Wilson rolled out a military response in favor of a sharp protest to Germany. The Germans ignored Wilson's call for peace. German leaders hoped to defeat Britain by resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. All ships, hostile or neutral, would be attacked. Wilson did not declare war and waited for a more overt act of war. The Zimmermann note, a telegram from Germany to Mexico, was intercepted by British agents. The telegram proposed an alliance between Mexico and Germany and promised that if war with the U.S. were to break out, Germany would support Mexico in recovering lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So this was evidence that Germany is planning to make direct action against the U.S., trying to draw Mexico, encourage them to attack us to keep us from joining the war. Next, 4 unarmed American merchant ships were sunk by German U-boats, killing 36 American lives. Germany is now making direct attacks against the U.S. that cannot be ignored. So, what German actions lead the U.S. to enter World War I? So, first we look at their U-boat policy, the fact that they sank the Lusitania, the fact that they're beginning unrestricted submarine warfare, where they will sink any ship on sight, whether it's military or civilian, that potentially puts our ships at risk. The fact that they are trying to make alliances with Mexico, trying to encourage other nations to attack us. All of this combined leads the U.S. to finally declare war and enter World War I. So the United States declares war. In April 1917, Congress voted in favor of U.S. entry into World War I. Wilson promised to make the world safe for democracy, and many Americans believed that the U.S. had joined the war to pave the way for a future order of peace and freedom. So Wilson tried to make it clear that we were entering this war not for spoils of war, not like with the Spanish-American War where we wanted to gain territory, but we were doing this to help to defend democracy and help alleviate kind of this Germanic dominance in Europe. So the United States will now prepare for war. So let's stop and think. What reason did the U.S. give for entering World War I? And so we talked about before all of the provocations that Germany gave, but now when we're actually entering the war, we're saying we're entering for good intentions to make the world safe for democracy. And this truly is an example of Wilson's moral diplomacy. We want to see the world become more democratic. We do not like these overtures of this um, Germanic Kaiser coming in and kind of just taking over, taking advantage of other countries. So we're going in for to make the world safe for democracy. So that is the end of the notes. Make sure